Welcome to the P.A.S. Report Weekly Roundup Podcast. The P.A.S. Report provides an honest analysis on the critical issues that matter to you without the biased media filters. Here's your host, Professor Nicholas Giordano.
What's up, everyone? Welcome to the P.A.S. Report Podcast. It's your host, Nick Giordano, and it's no secret that free speech has come under attack over the last couple of decades. I often speak about this on this podcast. The government abuses are staggering, and it's only getting worse. Especially over the last 5 years, we have seen a significant uptick in efforts to regulate and control information. Powerful entities, both in government and the private sector, they've embarked on this massive censorship push across our society where only one narrative can prevail, and that's the government narrative. This has certainly raised concern about the political erosion for free speech. The gatekeepers of information, they seek to dictate what you can and cannot see, what you can and cannot say, what you can and cannot hear. It's ironic that those who proclaim their commitment to preserving democracy are often the same individuals who undermine every single principle that underpin a free society. In fact, not only do they violate these principles, they frequently advocate for policies that restrict the God-given liberties enshrined in our Constitution, and it shows you that they no longer have a regard for the people. To them, the Constitution is nothing more than an inconvenient obstacle that hinders their pursuit of power. And rather than upholding the ideals of democracy, they seek to subvert it for their own personal gain. This hypocrisy has to end, because it underscores the need for all of us to remain vigilant, safeguard our democratic institutions, protect the liberties that are essential to our way of life. That's why, when you had Secretary Mayorkas announce the creation of the Disinformation Governance Board, it was crucial to speak out. And even some on the left, I have to say, were uncomfortable with this new body that was announced. And when you look at who was to head up this board, she was a wacko. It was the outcry that forced Mayorkas to pause and then disband the Disinformation Governance Board. And he did it on August 24th of 2022. However, is the board really dead? Or is it being rebranded and resurrected under a different name and a different entity? In this episode, I am going to explain the backdoor attempt to resurrect this program and how the government is using federal grant funding, your taxpayer dollars, to enlist academics to create a program that is designed to detect and strategically correct, that's their words, not mine, what they deem as misinformation and disinformation. Not only are these academics betraying the core values of free speech, intellectual inquiry, and open debate, but this continues to be a disturbing trend where we see this alliance between academia, the media, the government, big tech, where the lines of these institutions, they continue to blur. And it has real-life impacts on each and every one of us in the future of our society. I'm going to break it all down for you. Before I get into it, make sure you subscribe to the podcast so you never miss an episode. Go to the P.A.S. Report website, pasreport.com, sign up for the newsletter, and share this episode with family, friends, and on social media. This is a topic that is so important, and it threatens every American, regardless of whatever political ideology you may subscribe to. Now, with that being said, before I jump right in, I want to briefly talk about the 21-year-old charged in the leaking government information. There are two stories at play here. One is the actual leaker, and how did the leaker have this access to all this information? And the other is the actual information that was leaked. Now, as far as the leaker goes, we don't have the whole story yet, and I'm going to be interested to see more information because something doesn't seem right. I held the top secret security clearance for 12 years. Never once was I able to just access any type of information I wanted. Even if you hold a top secret security clearance, it's on a need-to-know basis because it could pose a grave threat to national security if it's released. And so how did this kid have access to all this information, and what were the motives behind him leaking it? And that's if the whole story's out there, because we don't know yet. I find it a little odd. Now, I don't care about the kid's age. People are making a big deal. Oh, he's only 21 years old. He shouldn't even have a top secret security clearance. I will tell you now, there are too many people in government that have security clearances. I shouldn't have even had a top secret security clearance. I was doing national security background investigations, But it was not like I was dealing with classified information at all. It was mostly just to get access to facilities. But even when I was on those facilities, whether it's the United States military bases, whether it's Plum Island Animal Disease Center, Brookhaven National Labs, I never went into the classified areas. I didn't need to go into the classified areas. So we certainly have too many security clearances out there, but I don't care about the kids' age. I mean, if we send 21-year-olds as platoon leaders into the theater of war, well, that tells me that they are responsible enough to handle sensitive and classified information. I mean, you're allowing them to lead troops into battle, so we have to understand that. So it's not about the kid's age. That's irrelevant. What it is about is how was he able to gain access to this information? And the information, understand, so he had information pertaining to the Pentagon briefings, which he's National Guard. So, okay, maybe he had access to that information. But then there was sensitive intelligence, and that intelligence did not come from the Department of Defense. That intelligence looked like some of it may have been CIA, some of it may have been NSA, whatever it may be. Even if you have a top secret security clearance, you still only have access to information on a need-to-know basis. And given that the leaked material was on a variety of different areas, I would be interested to know how he had access to all this information and whether or not there were more people involved, whether or not information was shared between people. Now, as far as the motives of this leaker, from what I'm gathering, and there's some people that will say, oh, it's a psyops and he's just the fall guy and everything. No, it looked like this person, he wanted to be bigger than he really was. He's an idiot. Plain and simple. It's not like he was working with the Chinese government and he was getting paid millions of dollars. That's easy to explain. It looked like this person wanted to appear more important than they really are. So that's the story with the leaker. Now, when we get to the actual leaked information, this is why I don't believe it's a psyops. These documents, they are really embarrassing to the United States, really embarrassing. And it shows how allies are abandoning us. But more importantly, it also shows how the government has been lying, telling the American people one story, and then behind the scenes, there's a completely different story. It's not really unusual, right? We saw the same exact situation in Afghanistan. For 20 years, we were talking about how we were making progress, how the Afghan government was stable, how the Afghan military could defend the government so it doesn't collapse. And that was all lies. Because we announced withdrawal, a week later, the whole country, the Taliban takes over, and we're still in the process of withdrawing. So it's not like this never happened before, but we're getting a different picture about the Ukraine. You know, there are so many in our media, in the government, that wanted to romanticize what's happening in the Ukraine. But the truth was always there. Russia was always the more dominant and superior military. They bungled it from the beginning. Certainly the Russian invasion didn't go as well as Russia had hoped. Certainly for better and harder than Russia anticipated, I think, than the rest of the world anticipated. Most thought that Russia would be able to sweep through the country in 2 weeks, and here we are over a year later. So obviously the Ukrainians, they've been fighting for their life, and they have been able to hold their own. But again, the truth was always there. The reality was that as Russia started learning from its mistakes, it started to recalibrate on the battlefield, and it started to make advances and gains. So you had the government, the media, the pundits out there, they were filling the American people with this false hope that Ukraine would somehow defeat this more superior military. And listen, when it comes to wars, anything is always possible, right? Nobody thought that the United States would ultimately end up defeating the British in the American Revolution. So there still is the 1% to 5% chance that maybe the Ukrainians can pull this thing out. But we also have to expect the opposite to happen. Now, these leaked intelligence reports show that Ukrainians are not doing well, that Russia is making advances, that Ukrainian weaponry is going to dry up, that Ukrainian government is having problem maintaining its forces. And when we look at that, think about the idea of misinformation and disinformation, right? So I constantly bring this up because it's the massive censorship push that we see. The government wants to be the ones that declare what's misinformation and disinformation, yet at the same time, governments, not just our government, but governments around the world and throughout history, have been the largest purveyors of misinformation and disinformation. And this is just another classic example. Now, the reason that the administration didn't want this to get out there is because it's embarrassing, right? And it's going to raise questions. How much money and weaponry are you going to continue to invest if most of the people behind the scenes believe it's a losing battle, believing it's a lost cause? And this is where we should have been putting forward a diplomatic solution at the very beginning when Ukraine was having battlefield successes, because we achieved our goals, right? We saw a weakened Russia and we saw a Ukraine that we could control given the money and investment that we've made. So we had our two objectives. That's what our objectives should have been. Well, our objective should have been to prevent this war from happening in the first place, because it was pretty clear that we could have prevented it. But since we didn't do that, and this administration is so feckless and incompetent, the very least, we should have been able to put forward a diplomatic solution. Now, here we are over a year later, and America is more isolated than Russia is. America has become isolated. America has become weaker. Countries, adversaries, have made enormous gains in the international community, particularly China, as it continues to gain power and influence. You have Lula over in Brazil, someone the Biden administration actually worked to get elected, who is now completely undermining the United States, who is now becoming one of the adversaries to the United States, talking about ditching the dollar, talking about ending U.S. dominance. This was a guy that the Biden administration helped get elected. So it shows you how thoroughly incompetent this administration is. But it plays into what I want to talk about today, because it doesn't seem that they're focused on the United States collapsing. It doesn't seem that the administration is focused on the United States losing its dominance and influence in the international community. Rather, what they're focused on is you. What they're focused on is ordinary people and controlling the way ordinary people speak, controlling what they say, controlling what they hear, what they see. That's what it's about. See, they don't trust you to make good decisions. They don't trust you to look at information and come to your own conclusion. They have to come to the conclusion for you. And that's what the Disinformation Governance Board was all about. It was about controlling a narrative, controlling a message. And on Tuesday, Fox News published my campus reform op-ed, and I have the link up at the website, PASreport.com, so check it out. In the piece, I explained how we were warned about this. We were warned about a growing and all-powerful government. We were warned about alliances being created between academia, between the media, between technology and scientists. We were all warned. We were warned about how grant funding can corrupt the system. You know, whenever someone refers to President Eisenhower's farewell address, they usually refer to his warnings about the military-industrial complex. However, his warning about the relationship between government funding and higher education, it often goes overlooked. But Eisenhower, he was a brilliant person. He was a person who understood the proper role of government. He foresaw the potential domination of our nation's scholars, worrying that grant funding would lead to an unholy alignment of our academic elite with the government. Take a listen to what Eisenhower had to say.
Crises there will continue to be. In meeting them, whether foreign or domestic, great or small, there is a recurring temptation to feel that some spectacular and costly action could become the miraculous solution to all current difficulties. A huge increase in newer elements of our defenses, development of unrealistic programs to cure every ill in agriculture, a dramatic expansion in basic and applied research. These and many other possibilities, each possibly promising in itself, may be suggested as the only way to the road we wish to travel. But each proposal must be weighed in the light of a broader consideration, the need to maintain balance in and among national programs. Balance between the private and the public economy. Balance between the cost and hoped for advantages. Balance between the clearly necessary and the comfortably desirable. Balance between our essential requirements as a nation and the duties imposed by the nation upon the individual. Balance between actions of the moment and the national welfare of the future. Good judgment seeks balance in progress. Lack of it eventually finds imbalance and frustration. The record of many decades stands as proof that our people and their government have, in the main, understood these truths and have responded to them well in the face of threat and stress. But threats, new in kind or degree, constantly arise.
Now, when you listen to the words he's using, you understand what he's talking about. Crises, there will continue to be. That the government will always push this idea as that a crisis is happening, that they need to take action in some way, that there's going to be a recurring temptation to feel that some spectacular and costly action could become the miraculous solution to all our current difficulties, to cure every ill. Now, when you think about that, just understand that we always look to the government to get involved, and it ends up costing billions upon billions of dollars. And yet, what did they exactly solve? What problem have they alleviated in our lives? So we need to understand that as we continue to grant the government more and more power. Now, when it comes to the academic part of this, you need to take a listen to what President Eisenhower had to warn about, because he understood that the combination that exists threatens our liberties and our democratic processes. Take a listen.
In the councils of government, we must guard against the acquisition of unwarranted influence, whether sought or unsought, by the military-industrial complex. The potential for the disastrous rise of misplaced power exists and will persist. We must never let the weight of this combination endanger our liberties or democratic process. We should take nothing for granted. Only an alert and knowledgeable citizenry can compel the proper meshing of the huge industrial and military machinery of defense with our peaceful methods and goals, so that security and liberty may prosper together. Akin to and largely responsible for the sweeping changes in our industrial military posture has been the technological revolution during recent decades. In this revolution, research has become central. It also becomes more formalized, complex, and costly. A steadily increasing share is conducted for, by, or at the direction of the federal government. Today, the solitary inventor, tinkering in his shop, has been overshadowed by task forces of scientists in laboratories and testing fields. In the same fashion, the free university, historically the fountainhead of free ideas and scientific discovery, has experienced a revolution in the conduct of research. Partly because of the huge costs involved, a government contract becomes virtually a substitute for intellectual curiosity. For every old blackboard, there are now hundreds of new electronic computers. The prospect of domination of the nation's scholars by federal employment, project allocations, and the power of money is ever present and is gravely to be regarded. Yet in holding scientific research and discovery in respect, as we should, we must also be alert to the equal and opposite danger that public policy could itself become the captive of a scientific, technological elite. It is the task of statesmanship to mold, to balance, and to integrate these and other forces, new and old, within the principles of our democratic system, ever aiming toward the supreme goals of our free society.
Again, listen to what he's saying. We must never let the weight of this combination endanger our liberties and democratic processes. Only an alert and knowledgeable citizenry can compel the proper meshing so that security and liberty prosper together. And then he talks about research becoming a central point. And this is what our higher education institutions do. Many of the four-year university systems do. And this is the whole point of a lot of the grants that go out to the university system. He explains how it becomes more formalized, complex, and costly. That a steadily increasing share is conducted for, by, and at the direction of the federal government. So think about it this way. If the federal government is the one providing the funding for these programs, isn't the higher education institutions and the researchers going to want to do what the federal government wants because they don't want the spigots to be turned off? I mean, if they research and say, well, misinformation and disinformation really isn't a problem, well, then we don't need any more government funding towards it, do we? So Eisenhower's warning us that the free university, the fountainhead of free ideas and scientific discovery, how it experienced a growth in its revolution in the conduct of research. And he understands that because of the huge costs involved, that government is going to get involved. And this is what he fears. He fears the domination of the nation's scholars and federal employment, project allocations, the power of money. And that's something that's a grave danger. And he talks about that policy is going to be pushed to the brink because of this. He said in the past, we used to be able to integrate these and forces and keep within the confines of the principles of our republic, of our free society. But we're losing that now. And we're losing that because we're witnessing it all take place right in front of our eyes. We see the destruction, the devastation. Now we're going to take a quick break. When I get back, I'm going to explain to you how the Disinformation Governance Board, while Mayorkas says it's been disbanded, I'm going to explain to you how it isn't really disbanded, that it is being resurrected, that they want a certain elite to control the messaging, to control the narrative of what can be said and what can't be said. So hang tight and we'll be right back. Listen up, P.A.S. report audience. Experts say that China is hoarding a massive amount of food. They're soon going to have over 2/3 of the globe's corn reserves, over half its rice reserves, and over half its wheat reserves. But when asked about it, China lies. And one expert says that they, of course, will never admit to doing something like that. Well, what does China know that we don't? When it comes to the global food shortages, China is the canary in the coal mine. And you have to understand, China is the world's #1 food importer. They rely on the rest of the world to keep their people fed, so they can't afford to mess up. There'll be riots, civil panic, or even worse, when over 1 billion people can't eat, it's going to create a crisis for them. What does that mean for us? What does that mean for Americans like me and you? Food shortages. That's why it's a smart idea to stock up on a kit of the best-selling 4 Patriot survival food. Create your own stockpile of the best-selling 4 Patriot survival food kits. It's hand-packed in the United States. The kits are compact, stack easily. They have different delicious breakfasts, lunches, and dinners, and I can attest to that because I use 4 Patriots, and their 5-star reviews on the website rave about the flavor and taste. Right now, you can get 10% off your first purchase of 4 Patriot survival food by typing in the code P.A.S. at checkout. Just go to 4patriots.com, use code P.A.S. to get 10% off your first purchase of 4 Patriot survival food. That's 4patriots.com. Use code PAS. Welcome back, everyone. So what am I talking about here? What am I talking about that the government is trying to rebrand the Disinformation Governance Board? Well, the University of Wisconsin has been awarded a $5 million grant by the National Science Foundation to develop a system that can detect and strategically correct what the government perceives as misinformation. And the examples they give in this grant application, which you could view it online, it's publicly available for everyone to see, is misinformation relating to COVID-19, elections, and vaccines. So they're openly telling us exactly what's going on. Now, this new grant is on top of a previous $7.5 million grant. Remember, when I say grant, that means your taxpayer monies that was awarded to 10 universities to develop anti-misinformation tools as part of their Trust and Authenticity in Communication Systems initiative. So now, what is this actually looking to do? Well, apparently, they're building out an AI system that's going to be used to flag posts and inaccuracies of what they deem as misinformation for journalists. So they want to incorporate these systems into newsrooms, and this is now going into the test phase. So you're seeing that the merging of the government, of higher education, of the media is being compromised. You're seeing this merging take place right before your eyes. And unfortunately, there's too many people that don't realize how dangerous this is. These powerful monitoring tools go against the core principles of the Constitution and easily be abused to push political agendas. By closely collaborating with the government to regulate speech, the autonomy of higher education institutions as centers of knowledge, as centers of free speech, discourse, and debate, well, now they're compromised. And it erodes public trust in these institutions. You know, it's amazing because when you look at you're just making a lot of hay out of nothing, you're trying to scare people and whip people up into a frenzy, this system is not going to be abused. Well, no, we've witnessed the abuses, right? I mean, we saw the Twitter files. We saw that the federal government, the FBI, paid Twitter over $3 million. We saw multiple government agencies, including the FBI, including CDC, including the Department of Homeland Security. We saw them flag posts for Twitter to censor. We know that the White House was flagging posts for Facebook and censoring them. The former press secretary told us so. So now what you have is a government entity contracting out those in higher education to create this program, and then those in higher education will then bring this program to journalists, who we all know that the objectivity of journalists is in question. The mainstream media just pushes the DNC talking points, that we already know, so they push political agenda. So now you have the academics working with the media. So what's the government going to say? Well, they're going to say, well, we're not the ones censoring information. We're not the ones labeling things as misinformation, although it's going to be them that are the ones that run the program. You know, not for nothing, but the government has a history of being the ones that spread misinformation. Remember the Gulf of Tonkin incident, WMDs in Iraq? You had the whole Bounty Gate issue. You would think those in higher education would be a little bit more skeptical, especially when you have incidents like the CDC's chief of digital media, Carol Crawford, pushing Twitter to censor what she deems as unapproved opinions. And it turns out that these unapproved opinions from the authors of the Great Barrington Declaration, it turns out they were actually right. It turns out that there were a lot of questions that should have been asked, that there was a lot of more skepticism that was warranted, that lockdowns didn't work, that closing schools for nearly 2 years had a disastrous impact. So all those that were being deemed as anti-government or anti-authority, well, it turned out many of them were actually right. But instead of acknowledging that they were right, what did the government try and do to the authors of the Great Barrington Declaration or other people that spoke out? Well, the government conducted a coordinated attack on Dr. Bhattacharya and Dr. Gupta, a coordinated attack to try and discredit them. And this attack came right from Dr. Fauci and Dr. Collins. So do I really want these people to be in charge and be the ones to determine what's misinformation and what's disinformation when they've been the biggest purveyors of misinformation and disinformation? And remember, I know that a lot of liberals don't care. Well, misinformation is a really big problem in society and we need the government to tackle it and take care of it. Okay, so now let's just bring it to a hypothetical. Let's say that President Trump wins in 2024. The former president wins and defeats Joe Biden. It's pretty clear that the former president's going to clean house. He's going to be firing a lot of individuals and putting his people there. Would you really want him to be in charge of determining what's misinformation, disinformation? So while you may like the idea now, well, what if it's someone from the opposite side of your political spectrum that has that power? Again, I don't want anyone to have that power. I'm pretty straightforward. If there's misinformation and disinformation out there, then you push back against it with facts, with evidence, with reason, with logic. You don't silence the information, because when you silence the information, that leads to more questions. That leads to people starting to lose faith in the system. It leads to more conspiracy theories. The effort to control speech and influence the media, it threatens the foundations of liberty. And in the past, many professors, they would have been appalled if government officials censored particular viewpoints. But we don't live in that past. Unfortunately, today, an increasing number of professors, they actually condone the censorship. And I brought their names up before on my podcast. You have Harvard Law Professor Jack Goldsmith, University Law Professor Andrew Woods, who argued in Atlantic that China has the right approach when it comes to internet surveillance, speech controls, and censorship. They suggest that America should adopt a more authoritarian approach similar to communist China. That's what they suggest. It's amazing because we see when it comes to misinformation, disinformation, and we look at how government grants are being used to actually weaponize the system, you see that the problems are compounded by the fact that you have this academic and political elite, and they usually come from the same type of social and intellectual circles. Take Richard Stengel, a former Obama administration official, and someone who is the ex-president of the National Constitution Center, where he argued that free speech is a design flaw in the system, that the founders never really intended for free speech to be there. And this notion is actually gaining traction among a growing number of individuals, including in academia. It's amazing because you look back at academia and they were the ones that used to fight against conformity and pushing back against conformity, and they've become the biggest conformists to exist out there. You have some academics who are nothing more than political propagandists. And you have these scholars that are conducting quote-unquote research. Well, don't you think that if they're getting funded to the tune of millions of dollars per year, don't you think they're going to produce the results that supports the government's policies and the government's point of view? Doesn't that actually make sense? And isn't it fair to ask if government funding is contingent on acceptance of certain narratives, of certain findings in published works? So we already have, and we need the parameters of that study to get to that conclusion. Taxpayer dollars should not be used to fund projects that undermine core American principles, such as free speech and thought. And universities should be prohibited from collaborating with the government to develop tools for monitoring and regulating speech. I mean, are you kidding me? Because we've seen this play out before. Just so every one of you is aware, this isn't like this is the first time. I'm just bringing the most recent example because the Disinformation Governance Board is still fresh in people's minds. But this government initiative, it's reminiscent of 2003 when the government looked to create the Total Information Awareness Program. And the government provided $100 million in grants to universities. $100 million, taxpayer money. This money went to the Carnegie Mellon University, it went to MIT, went to Cal State, all these different universities to develop a program aimed to mine every American's digital footprint. Now, while they say that the program was disbanded, the ACLU was outraged over, that's when the ACLU actually fought for speech and thought in the Constitution. But they say it was disbanded. No, it was never really disbanded. The program's elements were later incorporated into the National Security Agency's PRISM program, which was a clear abuse of power, which clearly violated the individual privacy rights of Americans and was a clear violation of the United States Constitution. And not only that, to add insult to injury, our officials lied directly under oath. They were never held accountable. They were directly asked whether or not they're collecting the data of the American people. They said no, people like James Clapper and John Brennan. So they committed perjury. They were never charged for that. But we've seen these abuses take place. You have the higher education system now create these programs. The government then takes them, expands them, and we see the abuses of power take place. That's why it's so important for you to wake up. If our country is so weak that it can't withstand questions, that it can't withstand dueling narratives, that it can't withstand people deciding for themselves, making up their own minds, if our country is so weak that that represents a threat, that free speech and freedom of thought represents a threat, then do we even deserve to stand anymore? Because a healthy democracy requires a diversity of opinions. It requires a diversity of perspectives. It requires robust public debate. We look at this grant funding, your taxpayer dollars, and it's turned higher education into nothing more than an extension of government to push a radical agenda. And that threatens to erode the heart of not just higher education, but the concept of individual liberty. The collusion between the government, the academics, the media, big tech, and the giant corporations is out of control. And it has to come to an end. We need leaders to stand up and fight back against these efforts. I'm calling on every single member of Congress to introduce legislation that no grant funding can be used to spy on the American people, can be used for higher education to develop tools so that those tools can be used against the American people. We need people to stand up and actually contact their members of Congress, because this is out of hand, and it's only a matter of time before this program, this course correct program, does morph into what the government wanted as the Disinformation Governance Board. Now, I hope you found the content of this episode informative and enlightening. If you did, please share it with your family and friends and on social media. Also, leave the P.A.S. report a 5-star rating and take 30 seconds to write a review on any podcast platform that allows it. I want to thank you for joining me today, and I'll be back on Monday with another great episode of the P.A.S. Report podcast.
Thank you for listening to the P.A.S. Report Weekly Roundup Podcast.
Have a good one. Bye.
Be sure to rate, share, and subscribe to the podcast so you'll never miss an episode. Also, visit PASreport.com and follow us on Twitter at PAS Report.